cold perfume woke me. Not the clean, floral kind that speaks of mornings. A bruised, smoky French scent that clung to my pillow like a promise. I sat bolt upright, heart a piston, and every sane piece of me tried to stitch the night back into something ordinary. It wouldn't hold. Not after Inferno. The club should not have existed on a map. Its neon sign flickered like a threat, its door humming with the wrong kind of quiet. But I had played there twice now, and both times the world outside and the world inside had refused to line up. People know. Things went missing in this town all the time. Everybody shrugged. Everybody looked the other way. Tonight the shrug had teeth. I didn't want to go back. I told myself that a dozen times over coffee, pacing, and internet searches that found nothing but rumor and bad reviews. Still, by 6 I was in an Uber, the receipt a thin insurance policy I showed myself when my palms began to sweat. The boulevard that led to Inferno had puddles that reflected the sky as a bruise. When I stepped inside, the air slapped me, stale smoke, spilled liquor, and something metallic beneath it, like a tongue of rust. The bar was a maw. The barkeep, Ivan, if his name tag was to be believed, looked like he'd been pressed into paper and folded. A face too narrow, skin so pale it might have forgotten the sun, and a height that made the doorway look small. He spoke in a voice that could have hollowed a room. He poured without looking, eyes sliding past me as if I were a playlist he'd already queued. There were creatures everywhere that passed for patrons. Scaled shoulders, too many eyes, mouths that smiled without any reason for joy. They licked their cups with tongues like ribbons and clacked their teeth in time to a grief-struck piano. I sat at the bench because the bench was where I'd always sat, because muscle memory had once meant applause and now only meant survival. The subtlest the boss had given me sat on the piano like a challenge. Slow train to Deathsville. Crossroads after dark. The devil owns my soul. They were jokes. I'd told myself until tonight I learned monsters had a sense of humor as black as coal. Trolls hurled barbed insults that stung worse than the beer. Ogres laughed like falling anvils. A two-headed brute waved a butcher's knife the size of a satellite dish. They wanted me to break. The room smelled of old disasters and newer threats that my hands found the keys. They were colder than they should be. Ivory gone bone. When I struck the first chord, it was like digging into cartilage. A bottle shattered. Laughter rose, wet and mean. I tried a simple vamp, anything to soothe the room, but my fingers betrayed me, like a forgotten language. Every song slipped away. Then she moved through the smoke. She was red in a way the world reserves for warning signs. Hair like spilled embers. Lips painted in a color that promised trouble. She glided between ogres the size of cars and sat at a table as if the room were only a small theater and she the headliner. The boss arrived at her heels. Bald, enormous, and the kind of man whose shadow bent the light. He had smiled like someone who collects storms. Quiet, she said, and the room fell like a dropped curtain. Let Hank play. Her voice wrapped around me. Everything in me wanted to run. Everything else wanted to please her. I chose to keep breathing and to press down the keys. I started with something light, the Addams Family theme, an old gag to buy time. The monsters reacted with a politeness that felt like a trap. Then I sang, half joke, half prayer, die with a smile, and the door slammed open like a punch. A new gang stormed in. Lizard men in cowboy hats, anachronistic weapons glinting, swagger that was a blade. Their leader hopped up on a table and demanded Tony. The room shifted. The redhead and the boss disappeared like smoke. Curtain gone, and suddenly the entire bar was a live wire. Then the real show began. Axes rose, guns cracked like the sky splitting. The henchman swung, the leader's hat flew off, and his head rolled toward me like a grotesque bowling ball. Blood varnished the floor. Chaos unspooled into violence, so fast it felt like being inside a shard of lightning. I slid beneath the piano, the varnish hot through the wood from the heat of the moment. Heads popped and fizzed. Maggots and globs and gore were painted onto everything. The cowpoke's head glared at me, eyes glassy and absurd. The intruders were efficient and cruel, shooting, slashing, turning the infernal audience into confetti. A pixie's skull burst like a rotten orange. A troll's face exploded in a bouquet of gore. The leather lizards darted along the walls like cockroaches that had learned to fly. And then the gas hissed dot from the back. The boss's voice thick, alien spoke words that ripped the air. He changed. The room was suddenly too small for him. His shape folded into something older and more violent. Scales. Wings. A dragon wrapped in Italian suiting, breath hot with an ancient hunger. Flames licked the gas, and the room detonated like a rotten sun. When the smoke cleared, the floor looked like a butcher's map. Bodies slumped in ridiculous angles, severed limbs and jagged torsos mixed with toppled tables and steaming drinks. The piano sat in the center, like a small, absurd relic untouched by flame. The redhead and the boss and even remained, as if survivors had been handpicked. That was fun, Tony said, wiping black goo from his trousers, like a man brushing crumbs from a tablecloth. His boots clicked toward me with the measured certainty of an executioner. He pointed at the ground and growled, "Hand me that head, why don't you?" His command was a law. I obeyed because my knees obeyed before my brain did. The head was heavier than life warranted, slick with gore that slid like wet tar through my fingers. My palms came away painted crime scene crimson. I wanted to retch. I wanted to be anywhere else. The redhead climbed onto the bench beside me then, her skin close and cool and smelling of that same impossible perfume. She purred something like approval. "Play us a song." "Something happy," she coaxed. "Delight like a tiny, poisonous bird. Slow train to Deathsville." Tony barked. Every time they said that title, it felt like a nail being driven through the night. I hated that song. I hated what it stood for. Not a tune, but a contract. A summons. A key they turned in me, they sent cleaners to haul the dead away, as if no apocalypse had just happened, and the bar could continue, like a theater with a single, stubborn intermission. Shadow creatures slid into seats where ogres had collapsed. The show must go on. The blood simply rearranged itself. I played on, fingers a tremor, streetlights in moonlight, leaking through the grime-streaked windows like a remembrance dot by 9. The crowd had thinned. I closed with Maxwell's Silver Hammer and Old. Absurd choice that felt like an apology to every corpse that had watched me perform. When the last note died, the redhead perched at my elbow, a cat on velvet, smiling in a way you only see in Predators. Evan cleaned a stool with a rag as though he hadn't just survived an infernal war. His fingers were long. His grin revealed teeth stained the color of cheap whiskey. He slid an envelope across the piano. Lighter than the first, heavier with a different kind of weight. Tony laughed and kissed the redhead in a display that was at once obscene and utterly mundane. Flesh leaned into flesh, and the room wanted an ordinary ending, so desperately it almost believed itself. I slipped, away toward the stairwell, like a thief at dawn. The steps multiplied. Breath left me hot and thin. I reached the top as if dragged by someone else's urgency and pushed through the exit into the alley that smelled like old oil and colder things. No way I'm coming back, I muttered into the thin night, a promise I meant with marrow and fear. A voice replied from above the doorway, shriveled and dry and full of a dreadful, patient malice. I froze. "If you don't," it said, and its words fell like a guillotine, "you'll end up like me." Above the exit, where the club had a decorative array of trophies, a severed head hung in a frame. Eyes glossy, mouth a-frozen, oh, its cheeks drooped in a perpetual accusation. The tongue lolled as if it had been mid-sentence before being silenced forever. I recognized it without wanting to. A musician's face, a warning. My hands trembled. I had, without really deciding, already written my name into their ledger. I went home and slept like a man who'd been promised no dawn. The perfume stayed on my pillow. It smelled like a reminder. Monsters do business in debts and favors and lists. They like to keep the same players on schedule. I told myself I'd quit. I told myself I'd never go back. But promises are thin things when someone else controls the strings. Days later, the envelope sat on my kitchen table, the money a weight that tasted like mercury in my mouth. The list was waiting. Slow Train to Deathsville sat at the top, a to-do with a tombstone beside it. My name was in the margins like a signature. You learn the rules quickly in places that operate off the map. Never look a monster in the eye and never, ever refuse a summons with teeth. You learn how ordinary fear can become an instrument, how a piano bench can be a witness, how a redhead's perfume can mark you forever when the town's lights go out and the people who should have saved us look the other way. Inferno hums. The trains keep running, and somewhere in the dark, a slow whistle calls my name. I keep telling myself I'll stop. I keep believing that belief for as long as the perfume lingers on my pillow. Tonight, the envelope waits. The head is still above the door at Inferno, grinning in a way that says this town will not give up its debts. The bench is polished. The keys are cool. The monsters have already warmed the seats. They like an audience that knows how to play for its life. I play because